Hi, I'm Greg Farrar. It's July 31st, 2020, and this is my COVID-19 Trends live stream. It's been a few days, 5 days. Um, I normally go 4 days, but in the middle of this, instead of doing a blog, I did a Medium article. I started to write a blog, and then I said, this is getting complicated, and I could go really deep with this thing, and I could throw together into a single article everything that I've been saying in these live streams and in these blogs, and so I did, and put it on Medium. So I'll put if you haven't seen it, if you're interested in the stuff that I'm doing, you're probably interested in this article, because it really does just say all the stuff. Can I put it in the chat? I think so. There's the Medium article in the chat. Go take a read. It's a pretty long article, maybe 15-minute read, but it talks about the states of the United States. It talks about the metaphorical immune system hypothesis, namely that once a state in particular has had a big wave of the virus, then its immune system kicks in the form of people's behaviors driven by the fear of the epidemic and fear of infection, as people start to see other people getting sick, and as the policymakers start imposing mandatory rules, people start to follow rules either by themselves or because of their policymakers, and the net result is the disease goes down, and then those policies remain in place, and at least to some degree for a while, but especially they remain able to leap back into place if necessary, and in that sense function a little bit like the human or any immune system, in that if a new wave comes, it can get smacked down pretty quick. Now, I've gotten a lot of feedback on this article. It's been mixed. I put it in particular on a scientifically minded group that I'm in, COVID on Facebook, and there's been some question about whether what I'm doing is actually science. I think that's an interesting question, and also whether I'm overreaching whether my hypothesis overreaches the data. Generally, people agree that the United States has peaked and is declining. The data really obviously supports that, but are much less certain that there won't be another wave in the medium term. So we'll see. That is a bolder and perhaps foolhardier hypothesis than the simpler one, which just says we're peaking and cases are going to go down for a while now. But my theory remains, and we don't have a lot of strong evidence against it yet, my theory remains that there's not going to be another big wave in the United States, and that's partly because in the medium term, 3 to 6 months, we'll have our immune system in place to knock down the little waves as they come before they can get big, and then in the longer term we'll have vaccination. And there's a whole, what's the word I'm looking for? Bolowax, barrel of monkeys, I don't know. There's a whole mess there, can of beans, around whether vaccines whether they'll even exist, whether they'll work. If they do, whether they'll be accepted by the population. If they are, whether they'll be available to the population, if they even want to accept them. Just now I saw something about how there's some concern that the federal government isn't doing all it could to facilitate the distribution of these vaccines when they become available. So there's this mad rush to make them, and it just might be that we'll have 100 million examples of it sitting in a laboratory somewhere or a factory somewhere, and no one will be able to use it because we won't have the distribution. So there are a lot of things that can still go wrong, but still, it's the theory I've been talking about, and so far I think it's not obviously true, but I think it's plausible that we are peaking, we are heading downward, and more controversially, that we won't come back with a big wave in the medium future, 3 to 6 months as a country. Individual states might get waves, and in this article particularly goes on. It does something that I've never quite had taken the time to do before, which is it goes through essentially all the states and says this was the first wave and lists the states. This was the second wave in May, lists the states. This is the third wave in June and July, and lists the states. And then it says if a state that has it never gets it again, or not for a while anyway, how many states are left after this wave? And the answer is pretty much none. There are 4 mostly small states that haven't really had a wave yet. The other 46 or 7 if you include DC, or even more if you include the territories, others of them have all had their wave or are in the middle of it right now. So let's move on to the actual data. And if you like the article, send it on to other people. It's got a lot of distribution so far through Medium and through Facebook, but obviously people must like it because they keep forwarding it on to all their people, and I like that because it gives me a sense that the thing that I'm doing here is plausible enough that people buy it and useful, and it is indeed a ray of hope in a media storm that's mostly negative. And by the way, I want to emphasize that one of the complaints I get about this article, you'll get about any optimistic article, is, oh, people are going to get complacent. I want to emphasize the way we got here, the way we got to this place where the United States has peaked and is declining, where all the hardest hit states have peaked and are declining. The way we got here is through behavior and through policy, I believe. I believe that's what's actually caused this to happen. Changes in behavior, masking, hand washing, physical distancing, all the rest is how we got here, how we overcame this rather large wave. And in fact, I would say the reason the wave is so large is because to some degree we haven't done those behaviors, we didn't do them early, and I do believe that the wave would have been smaller if we had. That also is controversial, but I think becoming less controversial, I think. Whether it's our behaviors that have really caused the virus to die away and not just some sort of natural progression that would have happened regardless of what we did. But at least there's no strong evidence that I've seen to suggest that this just would have happened anyway. And so from there, I say we need to keep doing these things until the thing is stomped so flat that it's not likely to resurge even if we stop doing the things. So the behavior does talk about, or the article talks about the metaphorical immune system antibodies as being all these behaviors, the things that help us detect the virus and stop the virus, I guess. And all of those antibodies are now at pretty high levels. As I look around, as I walk around, it's rare for me to see someone in public without a mask anymore. And so those antibodies, in quotes, are at very high levels and are helping us to stop the spread right now. And I think we need to keep doing that. I suggest we keep doing that because I believe the evidence suggests that that is the cause of the peaking that we're seeing. So, moving on to the countries. So I'm going to kind of ignore Kyrgyzstan because I'll just say it may be that Kyrgyzstan had some extraordinary event, but it went away as fast as it came. So I'm going to say probably not. It was probably one of these cases where they suddenly rolled up every case they'd never called COVID-19, but really was COVID-19, and called it COVID-19 all in one day. So Kyrgyzstan may be a problem spot, but it's not as big. It's not number one in the world in severity. So this is my severity graph. Again, this the title is actually wrong. One of these days, among the many things that I can do in a day, I can fix this title. The severity is not actually daily cases per million times weekly growth ratio. It's actually now, it used to be for about a day, that was what it was. I changed it pretty quickly to daily cases per million times weekly growth ratio squared. That puts a stronger emphasis on growth, so this doesn't look, it looks less like the DCPM graph and a little more like the growth graph, but it's intended to consider both. If you have a very high number of cases relative to population, then you get a high number here. If you have a very high growth ratio, in other words, 2.0 would be you're doubling every week, 3.0 you're tripling every week, then you go high here as well. If they're both high, that's when you get numbers like this. Qatar had a high growth, really, really high number of cases, but also a fairly high growth, and so they were way out in the top now. But you see, they have fallen away dramatically. This is them down here at a mere 100. They are barely a severity warm spot anymore. Qatar is really getting over this thing, and everyone else is a bigger deal than Qatar now. Actually, let's take out Qatar so we can see the rest a little better. Notable here, when I scan the list, is how heavily represented America is. And I don't mean United States. The North and South America, Central America representation here is extreme. We've got, let's just look through it. The most severe cases: Brazil, Colombia, Panama, the United States, Puerto Rico. I always laugh because somehow it's a country here, and also a state in the next slide. Peru, I should just take it out. Argentina, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic. I think Bolivia is in South America, but for some reason I keep forgetting that that's true. Yes, it is. Honduras. I hope that's all. I don't claim to be up on all of my countries, even though I learned every single one of them back in 6th grade when I went to 6th grade in Holland. By the way, they make you learn every single country in the world and where it is. So I forgot it all by now, but just in case you ever wondered why the Europeans know their geography so well, it's reasons like that. That was, however, a diversion. So let's look again here at the number. This is at least half of them. Half of the countries in the world of the most severe countries in the world are in the Americas. The United States is no longer the most severe. There were times when it was, like just days ago actually, but it's been passed now. You can see the United States severity is dropping, and this is really what spurred me again to write this article. I wrote the other Medium article at the same time. My first Medium article was also when the United States was peaking in late March, and I was saying, look, there's all this panic running around, and especially in the pages of the major newspapers. But there's some good news here, which is, yes, we're still rising, and maybe even, yes, the growth rate's still rising, but we see the growth rate heading to zero, indicating that a peak is coming. And so we've been seeing this for a while for the United States, that it was heading towards a peak. And there it is. This is a peak in severity, so we'll see how it looks in DCPM. It probably isn't quite as dramatic in daily cases per million, but it's at least plateauing now in daily cases per million, and will be peaking very soon if it hasn't already. But the United States, anyway, in severity, thanks to a recent drop of growth rate, or negative growth rate, thanks to a shrinkage in cases in the United States, is now about 4th place, behind Brazil, which is suddenly looking really bad again. Brazil's been doing this sawtooth where, at one point I said, oh, Brazil's peaking, and it did, but then it went up and then went down, going up again now. So Brazil's the worst in the world. Colombia, also Panama, and that's, of course, South America right there, or Central South America, and then United States. So it's not even just that the Central South America represents many of the top ones. It's well, I guess okay, never mind. I'm not looking at all of them. These are the worst. These are just Central South America. Let me pull back to look at the whole list again so we can see who's really the worst. So Kyrgyzstan, if you believe it, had an extraordinary burst there. Oman, Israel, Brazil, and then we're down into Central South America, what you're talking about. Bahrain was, with Qatar, was really bad, one of the two worst. It's also gotten better, but is not in any way matched Qatar's recovery. Qatar down to almost 100. Bahrain is still a hot spot, up above 200. And so is the United States at 220, though, again, dropping. South Africa, Puerto Rico. So those are the worst countries in the world right now. Let's look at daily cases per million, though, because this maybe isn't as useful a graph as severity, but it's in some ways a more real graph than severity. This is the actual on-the-ground reality of how many cases there are happening right now. So Bahrain is actually the worst in daily cases per million. So why is it so low in severity? Well, it's because it's shrinking faster than most. And that's what severity is doing. It's taking into account that though you have a lot of cases, you're shrinking fast. So you shouldn't be you shouldn't be counted as severe. Whereas something like Kyrgyzstan, which had that remarkable growth spike, really, it also has a lot of cases, but it also had, I think, like a 200% growth spike for some day or some week. But here's where it kind of really is. Kyrgyzstan is one of the worst in the world. And, well, if we look at it, we can see what happened here. Yeah, I was wondering whether it was just a data anomaly for Kyrgyzstan. I don't think so. There was some sort of a amazing spike, but it wasn't just a single day spike where they, like China on February 11th, I think, and other countries have done this, other regions have done this, changed the way they counted cases and suddenly said, we've got, I don't remember the numbers, but let's say 15,000 cases today, and that's 1,000 that are actually from today, or 100 from today, plus all the ones that we should have counted all along. That doesn't seem to be what's happening here, because if it were just a one-day spike, then it wouldn't continue along, having as many daily cases all along. Now maybe they just started counting differently this day, but didn't count all the historical ones in that day, and haven't tried to back patch it. But in any case, the reality of Kyrgyzstan is it's fairly serious right now. There, 250 daily cases per million is not a dramatic problem. We've seen 1,000 sometimes, but above 200, I do consider a hotspot. So Kyrgyzstan is a hotspot. And what this graph really says is that there are no super hotspots in the world at all. These are the top 20 daily case per million countries, and all of them are under 300. Now, 200 and above is bad, but we've seen a lot worse in the past sometimes, especially Qatar. And where's that, Bahrain there? Yeah. So things are looking a little better overall for the world. We don't have any really hard hit country right now in daily cases per million. That said, there are 20 countries at least that are warm spots or hot spots. There they are. We talked about them before. They're pretty much the same ones as the most severe ones. And just looking at the graph roughly, we can see the hardest hit ones are getting better, but the lesser ones are getting worse. They seem to be rising. Let's go to the growth chart and see if that's true. So the other component of the severity, actually I'm going to turn back here so I can look at chat in case anyone wants to drop something in chat. All I see in chat is myself. Okay, let me see for a minute. What am I doing here with this stream? Okay, so growth. Of the hottest countries in daily cases per million, the 20 we just saw, this is what direction they're going. This is their growth rate. If they're below 0 on this graph, they're doing well, they're shrinking. Fewer cases every day. If they're above 0, they're rising, more cases every day. And of these hardest hit countries, there we see Kyrgyzstan again with its weird spike, but mostly it's doing kind of okay. Its very latest day is 10% growth. I mean, it's still growing, which we don't want any of these to be growing, but it's not a really exceptional outlier way ahead of the pack in growth. The ones that are growing, Puerto Rico, Argentina, Colombia, Costa Rica, this is, in other words, Central South America, Israel, not Central South America, you can see that they're trended downwards. The ones that with the worst growth rates are trending downwards in their growth rates. So they're heading towards 0, which is the point at which they'll peak in total cases. So that's good. We at least have some short-term trends here. When you look at something like Argentina here, it's hard to really look at this little hook and make much of it. Their broad trend has been upwards more. If you look at this sort of puke green, I guess, olive green, I don't know, that's also olive green. The lighter green, if you look at that, you can see it's hard to say what its real trend is, but maybe it's starting to look better. Colombia looks a little clearer, and I'd say Puerto Rico also a little clearer that it really is heading downward. Costa Rica also heading downward, but more importantly, it's been heading downward for a long time, so that's promising. Kyrgyzstan, of course, is zooming downward. Dominican Republic has been fairly flat. And then we have what's maybe one of the worst ones here, Brazil. Brazil is rising, not by a huge amount. 12% a day isn't a huge amount. We sometimes see 40. Indeed, we do see 40 for Puerto Rico right now. But Brazil is also accelerating. The line is pointed upwards. So Brazil's growth rate is getting worse. So Brazil is a problem. But given what we've seen a month ago, if we looked at this graph, there'd be a lot worse problems than what we're seeing in Brazil there. The big picture in Brazil, I'll just look at it alone for a minute. It's broadly heading downward. It has been for a long time. Broadly heading downward, has some waviness to it. Short term seems to be heading upwards, but it's done that before and got over it. So what's it going to do? Who knows? but certainly the long-term trend is downward, the short-term trend is upwards. That's kind of a mixed bag. Bolivia and the United States. The United States, of course, a major focus of this live stream, so let's take a look at the United States in detail. Now, the United States, I'm going to cut out that early part. At the beginning of an epidemic, the growth rate ends up being huge for, the reason is something like the first day you have one case and the second day you have two cases, and suddenly that looks like 100% growth. But it's even more than that. It really does seem to accelerate very quickly at the very beginning. Suddenly you'll have 10 cases the next day. That's 1,000% or 500% growth from 200 and so on. But it very quickly levels out to something more reasonable in the, I'd say, negative 20 to 50% range. And so here's the United States in the negative 20 to 50% range. It had that nice period back when it seemed like we were over it, back in May. And then suddenly everything went to hell in June. And it rose and rose and rose. It had a 30-40% growth rate, very high, very sharply accelerating. And then eventually we started seeing it turn towards a plateau, which it reached on July 5th, not that long ago. And ever since it's been heading down. This is the growth rate, not the total cases, not the daily cases, the growth rate. And so at a place like 10% on July 27th, that meant that if you have 100 cases, or let's say 10,000 cases today, then you'll have 11,000 cases tomorrow, a 10% growth every day, which means the cases are still rising. And even now, according to this graph, the cases in the United States are still rising, but only at 4%. And you can see that it was at 8% 3 days ago, I think. So we can estimate this graph will probably hit 0 in 3 days, and then this graph will actually say, yes, the United States has peaked, and we're going to start to see fewer and fewer cases. I will say, however, well, this graph is on a 14-day rolling average, so it takes it a couple weeks before it really starts to notice trends. I don't use these graphs much anymore, but I do want to show it in this case because it gives a somewhat different answer. Similar thing, growth rate. In this case, it's a 7-day on average of each week, shown each day. Anyway, it has dropped below 0 according to our rope chart here. The United States has dropped below 0, and that's because it's a 7-day rolling average, not a 14, and so it moves a little bit faster. The trend line itself bends slowly, but the dots are quicker to pick up, each of them being a 7-day moving average. They're quicker to pick up that something is changing. Now that said, we do have a couple of dots slightly above 0 still, our most recent dots, but we had a bunch that were below 0. Overall, the trend line in both cases seems to be clearly downward, steadily downward, solid month, sustainably downward. The United States is turning the corner. And maybe I'll just look at Brazil for a minute, just to say, there's Brazil, obviously showing a downward trend in the long term, somewhere around turning the corner, but showing a brief upswing. All right, I'm going to switch to the states. Well, actually, I'm going to very briefly just say, probably not spend much time on it. I added a whole section on deaths. People have been asking about deaths. People have been suggesting deaths are more relevant or more real. And actually, I'm probably going to spend a little bit of time here. I thought I was just going to swing by here, but let me talk a little bit about this. I have always focused on reported cases, and I've always gotten flack about it because people say, well, reported cases aren't actual infections. Reported cases are dependent on testing. If we have a 1 week delay for tests to come back, like as was the case with my own last test, which took 6 days to come back, we don't get the reported cases until far after the infections, so late that it's maybe not even useful. Okay, fair enough. And these are all true. My general answer has just been, this is the metric I'm tracking, partly because it's the most easily accessible metric, but also because I believe that it tends to be proportional to all the other metrics. I believe that cases tend to be proportional to deaths. They may be offset by a week, though in the early days of this live stream, we seem to be seeing there was no offset at all between cases and deaths, reported cases and deaths, which is weird. You'd think that people would die after their case was reported, but maybe not. Maybe they tend to report cases at the same time that people die and say, yeah, that person died and it was from COVID. Anyway, but there have been, especially from the dare I say, minority of the population who believes that the lockdowns are all stupid and masks are stupid and none of this is effective, there's been a real emphasis lately on how deaths are dropping, even while cases are rising. This has died down, and you'll see why soon enough. In the United States, deaths are dropping, cases are rising. So that we saw that extremely high rise. Let me see if I can bring it back. The United States' extreme June. June was really bad in the United States. It was accelerating, it was high in growth rate, and it also had a fair number of cases. So it had everything going against it. But at this very time, there was a fair bit of talk about how it didn't seem like deaths were dropping. Now, by the time I got into the game to actually check that claim, which I think was true at the time, deaths did, if I said that backwards, deaths seemed to be dropping even though cases were rising. By the time I got into it, maybe around here, a week ago or something, that was not the case anymore. And so the fire or the wind had gone out of the sails of that particular argument. The argument being that since deaths just drop and drop and drop, obviously there's no problem. They're going to get to zero soon. We should just unlock everything and all start gathering in groups again. I think that that argument has ceased to become the buzz that it was, because it's very clear now that deaths are rising. And it may well be that deaths are rising because the cases were rising. It seems like that would be how it would go. If you have a big old June for cases, you might have a big old July for deaths. But they don't quite match up. It seems like there was a long delay from when the cases rose until the deaths rose. So there is still something of a mystery there. But in any case, I have death graphs now, daily deaths per million. The United States is in the top 25 in daily deaths per million. You can see there are some really crazy ones like Peru and Kyrgyzstan. Maybe they're real or maybe they aren't. Or Chile, which I think probably really is real, which have a rather astonishingly high number of deaths. And then down at the very bottom, not the very bottom, but close to the bottom, we have the United States with relatively few deaths per million. Other factors that affect deaths are also treatments, improved treatments. There's been a lot of talk about various drugs that I won't name by name because they seem to have political associations with them now. Not only are masks political, but pharmaceuticals are political too. But there are some drugs that some people think work and some people think don't. And there are other drugs that the first people think don't work and the second people think do work. And anyway, some drugs probably work and some treatments probably work. And so as we learn what those are and keep trying, even in desperation, treatments that aren't proven to work, we may actually find that the deaths go down because some of the treatments we don't know work maybe really do work. So the United States, anyway, not looking too bad in deaths, but not looking great either, and certainly rising. And by the way, I also have I have the comparable growth chart for deaths, which is to say, yes, our deaths were dropping, which is to say below zero on the weekly growth chart, and now they're rising again for a little bit where it seems like our deaths are rising. 14%, again, not a huge percent, but they are rising. All right, that was a lot on the United States, or on the countries, given that I have, actually I'm going to get rid of this thing. You can probably see that, can't you? Yeah, I'm going to log out of here so we have a little bit more. It's probably going to show me nope, don't want to log in. Don't want to log in. I just want to go straight to the States. Come on, States. Given that my Medium article was all about the States, more than the United States as a whole, well, it was kind of both, but it wasn't mostly about the countries, though I did bring in Italy as an example of how a typical growth curve goes and how it seems most of the United States growth curves are going. Anyway, here we are in the States. So as I guess I may have a few new subscribers now that I have made that Medium article and maybe brought a few people here that weren't here before. So I should say this comes in 3 segments. I live part-time in California, and the company, my employer who funds this, Joby Aviation, is located in California, and therefore there is a focus on the United States, the states of the United States, and the counties of California. So we're done now talking about the countries of the world. Now we're going to talk about the states of the United States, and finally about the counties of California. And the whole thing will be maybe an hour long at most. So severity, again, my favorite metric, my own metric, my baby, severity. We can see the Florida and Arizona, which were the boogeymen of, big boogie people of early July and late in June, really looking a lot better now. Let's look at them. This again is in severity. So it does combine both their growth rate and their daily cases per million. But look at those graphs. They are almost a third, down to a third or a half of what they were. So Florida and Arizona absolutely recovering, and that's good news. Texas sometimes gets lumped in with them, and it certainly never got nearly as bad as them. But I will say that on the short term, at least, it seems to be starting its recovery. It's kind of like when as they went super high, it just hung out this plateau, and now it's joining them in recovery. California, since I know that a lot of my listeners are in California, also recovering. Also, it never got as bad as Texas even, now recovering. Still, all of these still severe. All of these are severity hotspots. So recovering doesn't mean recovered. 200 is bad, and they're all above there. And there are a lot of states that are severe. If you look at this graph, in fact, you may recall that in the countries, when we found the most severe countries, about half of them were above 200, and half of them were between 100 and 200. But in terms of severity, we can come up with almost 20 states that are hot spots, not just warm spots in severity. And there they are. And so, yes, that's bad. The good news, though, if we look, let's just look through them really quickly one at a time and say which ones are really doing poorly and which ones are doing well. I'll keep the ones that are doing poorly because there aren't many. Mississippi is doing poorly. Louisiana is recovering. Nevada, it's in some sort of a wavy plateau. Not doing great, but at least headed downward now and plateau in the medium term. And I'm going to say it's doing okay. Florida is doing very well in terms of recovery. Alabama also recovering in the short term. Tennessee is on a plateau, so sort of. Missouri is doing poorly. And really what I'm looking here is how sharply upward angled are these states? Where are they headed in severity, not where are they in severity? Missouri is a lot, Mississippi's a lot worse than Missouri, but both of them are headed upwards. And by the way, let's see, Arizona was way worse than either of them. Mississippi is really trying to be a new Arizona. It wouldn't take long for it to be our worst ever. In Florida as well, way above them, 800, 900 at its peak, but these ones are rising while it's falling away. Idaho, doing well. May have already done these. South Carolina doing okay, heading downward. Again, all of these are severe. All of these are in a bad place, but all the ones that I'm ignoring here are heading to a better place. Arizona, of course, is heading in a good direction. Oklahoma, not so good. I'll keep it. Texas is heading into a better place. Oh, now I just ruined everything. What was it? Mississippi, Missouri, Oklahoma maybe were the bad ones. Texas is doing okay. Alaska has had its interesting wave here, but for now is certainly doing very well in trajectory. California is recovering. Puerto Rico is flat-ish, kind of low, kind of flat. I guess I'll keep it. Kentucky is not looking good, even though it's low, it's heading upwards. The tiny little hook here doesn't mean anything. We haven't had enough time to say anything there. Maryland, interestingly, is severe and rising, which is strange. North Carolina is recovering a bit. Wisconsin's recovering a bit. Could keep that one in there. And Nebraska is not recovering. So actually, this is more than I thought. We have 7 out of the 20 that are looking kind of bad, and 2 that are looking very bad. If your country starts with MISS, it's not a good thing. The rest are doing, it's a little unclear how these are doing. Very unclear, I'd say. But they're all severity hotspots. So that means that there are 13 that are clearly getting better. They're severe but getting better, which is good. There was a month ago when we were doing this thing, it was just everything was heading upwards and no one was turning around. So good to see that doing better. And these are all the countries. Now all the states, I mean. If you wanted to look, you can go to the website, gregfarrar.us, and you can do your own, click on this, click on that to figure out which ones are the worst. But let's go to daily cases per million. One of my favorite metrics. Kind of looks like the severities graph, really. The top 20 in daily cases per million. We can see, however, that in terms of in this sense of hotspot, a DCPM hotspot, there are only maybe 12 or something that are hot, and then the rest are mere warm spots. If we look at Florida, we can see it's turning around, and it's kind of redundant to go over this one because it does fairly closely follow the severity graph. So maybe I'll just go straight on to growth, because the growth is one of the things that bends the severity graph, and in some sense, I think this is the most interesting graph right now. With my optimism bias, I love to see good news, and this is just all good news, almost. These are the worst, those 20 states we just saw. The DCPM hottest, not the most severe, but the hottest in daily cases per million. The worst states in the number of cases they're having right now, adjusted for population. This is them, and I don't think it takes a lot of squinting to see that this rope is headed downwards. Some of them, there are a few exceptions, like Maryland did rise, though it seems to be recovering now. Maryland is actually heading downward a little bit. And certainly Alaska had that wild peak to 100% weekly growth. That's extremely high growth. We don't usually see above 40, but it is clearly recovering. And then we've got Missouri, one of the worst, you may recall, very, very high growth rate at 50%, but at least the growth rate isn't rising. There's not a single line on this chart that I can point to and say that's got everything we don't want to see. And there often is. We have often seen this graph where there's some line which is way up high and it's angled upwards. We see a couple pretty high ones, but they're all angled downwards, at least a little bit. Or at least they're not angled upwards. And we see this one angled upwards, Oklahoma, which is actually one of our more problematic states right now. But it's not that high yet. So it's growing 20% a week, which certainly isn't good. That's 3% a day or so. Pretty bad news for Oklahoma, but it's angled upward and it's accelerating. So there's not really a but about Oklahoma. Oklahoma is one of the worst states right now. It has everything we don't want to see. This long-term trend has been flatter than that. If we pull out for a minute, we can see we don't necessarily get too worried when you look at the long trend and say, well, it used to be 60 and then it was 40 and now it's 20. Isn't that a downward trend? Yeah, that is a downward trend. Its overall trend is downward, but in the short term, Oklahoma is waving back upwards again. So a mixed bag for Oklahoma. But the rest of them, look at them. They're all headed downwards. And what's really great is just something I don't think we've seen for, when you can look at this graph, we basically have not seen this for months, is that a lot of states, a sizable collection of our hardest hit states are shrinking now. They're below zero. Let's zoom in on this a little. So anyone below zero is shrinking. I cut out someone. Actually, I'm going to go just make sure I don't neglect the best one, which is Arizona. Arizona is shrinking at 12% a week. It's doing extraordinarily well right now, Arizona, in terms of the direction it's going. Again, it has a gazillion cases, and by no means should you take this, Arizona's, as any sort of recommendation to change anything you're doing. This just means that what you're doing is working. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it, because if you change something, it might make it worse. And if it's masks and social distancing, it probably will make it worse, as far as I have been able to determine. But Utah here, the gang of six we've talked about. Utah, that's one of the gang of six. Now shrinking, 5% a week. South Carolina, also in the gang of six, shrinking. Kansas is shrinking. Texas is shrinking. Texas has turned the corner. Let's look at Texas, because Texas has sometimes looked really bad. I mean, look at it there, above 60%. But in 1 month, Texas has turned this around from being one of the worst. Let's see if it really was the worst then. Nope. Nope. Florida and Arizona and Idaho actually were worse than Texas back then. But anyway, Texas was plenty bad. Third worst in the state of the states on June 30th, and it turned it around, and we've seen this steady improvement, and now it's actually shrinking. It's turned the corner. its daily cases per million should be peaking. And just for kicks, let's look at its daily cases per million. Not the trajectories. Well, we can do that too. It's the same graph, just shifted. So for Texas, yeah, totally. Texas from this you would think that it peaked a week or two ago. So that it according to this graph, and again we have these differences of 14-day moving averages versus 7-day moving averages. I think this is 14 days, so it's a little slower to catch on, but still, they all agree that Texas is heading in a good direction and is actually shrinking now. So Texas, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. California, also really good news for California. By no means are we over and out of it. And the question of opening schools, we're still growing. So I don't know about opening schools, but that's a very difficult question. I'm not really going to take a position on it, but I will say that from a perspective of the virus, of this data, California has not recovered. And if somehow the schools are being open because we think it's recovered, that's clearly not the case. I assume they're being open for more complicated reasons than that. So, in any case, on the bright side, here we are at the end of July. We still have, when do schools open? Sometime September. We still have a month, as much as a month, maybe even more than a month. Maybe they're even delaying the opening a little bit. And if we actually had a month at this trajectory, well, we couldn't possibly actually. It wouldn't, not even mathematically possible. But if we drop below zero and can hold it there for a month, even if it's just a 10% or 20% reduction, then we will be over it. It will have shrunk to a quarter or a tenth of its size in terms of daily cases per million. So California is not there. Every single day we see here is a growth day. Every single week here is above zero. Since the beginning of tracking here, it's always been above zero on this graph. But it looks like it finally might turn the corner, California, in just a day or two, to start to see negative growth as a whole. Doesn't mean that all the counties will see negative growth, because we'll always have imperial or kings, these royal names. I don't know what it is about emperors and kings that make them more likely to get coronavirus, but this seems to be the pattern in California. We'll see that in the next slide. All right, so California looking good. Also, I for my Louisiana lovers, Louisiana is just the same. It's just the same. We have all these states, and again, you just pull back out. All the states are doing this. All the states, with a few exceptions, all the worst hit states are heading downward, and several of them have actually crossed zero. So if this continues, we're going to see all of them below zero in weeks, and the state will, I think the state is already starting to shrink, actually. The United States is starting to shrink. Did I show that? If I didn't show that, I probably should show that. The United States is starting to shrink. But, and you can see why. It's because all the states are solidly, the worst hit states are steadily downward. This wild graph shows all the states. I don't know. It's just so hard to make anything out of this graph in any sort of a general way. But okay, that's a pretty good zoom. When I look at that, I do also see that same trend, is that most of these lines are downward. Not all of them. I mean, look at poor Connecticut, for instance. But, and this is where severity comes in. Just because Connecticut has a 50% growth rate doesn't mean Connecticut has a problem yet, because Connecticut might have almost no cases, and I haven't seen Connecticut anywhere else. And so I think if we actually look at daily cases per million for Connecticut, we're going to see, yeah, Connecticut's below 50. So they do have that 50% it's going from 20 to 40 in 1 week here. That's a 50% growth rate, but 40 is low, 20 is really low, and so they have a lot of runway before they even hit the zero mark that would indicate a second wave. And by the way, this is a good time to the 100 mark would indicate a second wave. This is a good time to restate the thesis here, which may be false, but I'm going to keep restating until it's proven false, which is that once a state has a wave like this, it goes up in about 30 days, it comes down in about 40 days, and then it's done and it never comes back. And that I believe is because Connecticut, having been through this kind of hell, is well prepared when it sees a little blip like this, when the newspaper says we just doubled our cases in a week, then whatever they had that made this happen comes online very quickly. If people were getting lax about masks or social distancing, or if they had unlocked the state, they start locking everything down again, and that's what made this happen, probably. And assuming that's what made that happen, then it'll make it happen here too, but it'll happen right here. It'll happen at 50 or something, and it'll die away again, because they'll bring to bear and testing, I should mention that too, all their testing apparatus and contact tracing and quarantine and isolation and all the things they used to get out of this first wave. They're still there. They haven't turned them off. They just kind of don't have anything to do. And so now you have this state apparatus, and for that matter, individual apparatus that is prepared to cope with a hot spot, and suddenly sees we might be going back and says never again, and brings the full hotspot strength coping mechanisms to bear on a little blip, and that smashes it flat. So that's my guess. Connecticut, if I remember, we'll come back to this, but if I don't, we're just never going to hear about Connecticut again, because it's going to go away and it won't even be on any of my graphs at the top. But right now, it does show up in the as this very high growth rate, which is why I like to focus on severity, because when you look at severity, Connecticut it's kind of nothing. I mean, it's pushing a severity warm spot because of that, because it does have, it's got a 40 daily cases per million, and it's got a pretty severe growth rate. So there is this little tick upwards to say, hey, Connecticut might be becoming a problem. But if that growth rate goes away, that growth rate itself, by itself, is not extreme. Obviously, this isn't an alarming graph, and so the severity is, the growth rate is canceled out by the daily cases per million, and severity, therefore, is a good metric. So let's see if there's anything interesting else to look at. Maybe I'll just look really quickly at deaths, because I was doing that there, just to say the death rates were much worse. They got a lot better. This is this whole narrative that says, how can there be a problem when deaths just keep getting lower? But now they've really lost it. They're by no means as bad as they were, and I think never will be. But here's Arizona, and here's Arizona's huge wave catching up with it in deaths. And so the death rate will keep rising, because people who got it whose cases were reported 2 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago are only now finally dying of it. South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, there's another one, 4 big ones, Texas. So the death rates are rising in last month's daily cases news states. The states that were really bad last month, that aren't bad anymore, or at least are dropping in most cases rather rapidly, the deaths aren't dropping, because all those cases they got are now dying, the ones at whatever percent it is. And I guess I just want to say, I've spent a lot of time on this in my much earlier podcasts. The death rate, I haven't been tracking mortality rate closely lately, but I hear still numbers like 0.5% die. Now that's alarming. It's always alarming, and even if it's just 20 people get sick and 1 dies, that's alarming. But I just want to compare that to some of the mortality rates we've seen in the past. This is a very small mortality rate, so we're very lucky. I heard Dr. Fauci on a podcast the other day saying, I've been talking all these years about the perfect storm and the thing that I just hope to never see. And that thing would be, it would be a respiratory infection. It would be very contagious. It would spread through the air. And I think he said something else. But one thing he didn't say is it would have a high mortality rate. And so now we see that, and we see this growing and going. But I think he missed a point, which is if it has a high mortality rate, maybe not. There's this thing that happens with diseases where if the mortality rate gets too high, then they can't spread because the people die before they can spread it. But I guess the true perfect storm would be something that's asymptomatic and has like a 50% mortality rate. But a 50% mortality rate is possible. the bubonic plague, the pneumonic plague, the third kind of plague that swept through Europe and the rest of the world, parts of the rest of the world in the Black Death, I just want to remind us, had a mortality rate of 50%. If your town, and if you lived in Milan or Milano, and and it came to town, half of the people you know would be dead within months, weeks. So just to keep a sense of perspective, this is certainly a problem, but it's in some ways it's almost like a first world, or they call it a first world problem. We don't have it nearly as bad as the Middle Ages. Let's put it that way. The Middle Ages didn't have treatment. They had no idea what was causing it. They didn't know how to stop it. Things that they tried were just completely ineffective. We have so much more going on than Middle Ages, and even best of all, we have a plague that an epidemic that, if untreated, I mean, what would the mortality rate be if untreated? 2%. Effectively, the plague was untreated in the 14th century, I guess it was, because the treatments they tried were ineffective or damaging. But our plague, our modern day plague, is 25 times less severe than that one. So we can count our blessings on that one. These death numbers, 10 deaths per million people. Every day, 10 people die out of every million people. That's actually a lot better than it could be. So cross your fingers that we don't get a real disease one of these days that kills, 10,000 out of every million people every day. It's possible. Or that by the time that happens, we'll be so good at this that we'll just be able to vaccinate against it in 30 days or 10 days. I don't know. If one thing comes out of this, I think it's going to be some very high-tech vaccination creation tech, and I wouldn't be surprised if we develop the ability to vaccinate within weeks against a new disease after this. But that's a lot of speculation. Let's move on to the counties. So the states are looking pretty good. They're really very severe in cases. A whole lot of cases, a whole lot of states very hard hit. We still need to be very careful with all the things we do, but the things we're doing, whatever we're doing, whatever it is that's causing it, it's getting better. On to the counties of California. In severity. So when I see something like this, I always wonder if it could possibly be true. Marin County claims to have an 8,000 severity. Recall that 100 is a warm spot and 200 is a hot spot. I don't have words for thousands. And then we have Kern doing much the same thing. So let's dive into those just a little bit. Let's look at Marin and look at the two components of this and say, why is severity so high? There are two reasons it could be so high. Either, and these aren't exclusive, either or both, either it's so high because the daily cases per million is really high, a sudden spike in cases, or it's high because the growth rate is high, which also in the short term would be a sudden spike of cases. So if there were a very, very recent, very sharp spike in cases in Marin, well, then we would see exactly what we're seeing. And if you look at the daily cases per million graph, it kind of seems like there was. It reminds me of, forget what country that was we were looking at. I don't know, one of the old republics, but Soviet republics, I think. Turkmenistan or something. But whatever that one was, it did this thing where here it was tooling along at 100 or 200, and bam, it's at 800 in daily cases per million. Now, if that were just a day, well, see, this is a rolling average. So maybe there was just one, so it's possible that there's just one extraordinarily wrong day, and we're going to see for 14 days this will be really high. What we can see at least is there was a spike up to here, and the numbers have stayed there. I'm going to pop over to, actually I'm going to pop to this graph. Okay, yeah, so it really was this graph. I keep thinking of getting rid of these graphs, and then now and then I use them, because this is not a rolling average. This is an actual number. So Marin, it was just one day. Okay. I'm going to say this is probably a data outlier. It's probably just not true. Marin is not doing any too great. Daily cases per million is in the hot range, but that was either one of these cases where they pulled in a whole bunch of old cases and says we're going to recategorize the last 6 months of cases as COVID-19, or they or it's just a straight up data anomaly. But I don't think that they suddenly had 8,000 cases per million when they'd been going along at 200. So probably nothing truly alarming happening in Marin. Kern is a little more concerning. With Marin, over time, in a couple of weeks, this will just go away. It'll become one of those triangle spikes that we sometimes see. I could remove it, but I'm not totally sure that it's not legit. It could be, again, a recategorization. So I'll leave it there, but we'll just take it with a grain of salt. Now, Kern does also have a high number, but this number isn't totally out of whack with the rest. Kern has a real cluster now of high numbers, though the latest 3 are smaller. So something's going on in Kern, 400, 500, and then this crazy 2,000. Yeah, so Kern is out of control here. Let's look at it. Often when we see this, it's something like a prison epidemic, or some sort of a homeless encampment, or something like that. So I'll see if I can, if I keep seeing this, I'll tune into the Marin news and see what I see. But it does look like Marin has a legitimate problem that maybe is worse, actually, or Kern has a legitimate problem, maybe worse than Marin. Nevertheless, I'm going to remove these two as extreme outliers right now. I'm going to take out Stanislaus as well. This, by the way, did something very much like Marin and Kern are doing once upon a time, had this super spike, and now it's fine. So who's left? And those ones really were problems. Kings and Imperial, the royal couple, were really bad. We still see a whole lot of counties. By the way, I did something a little different with the data here, and you can see some of them go a little further than others. I got better, really. This is actually better than it used to be, because some states, counties, for whatever reason, are slow to report, and I don't have data past the 29th, or they report the 30th, but it's the same as the 29th. And so this is the very best I can do to give us data for those that have it, while also not messing up the ones that don't. So we have more recent data for Madeira, and by the way, it's looking better, but still extremely severe. And here we see the top 20, as with the states, when you pull out the top 20 worst hit counties of California, they're all hot spots. They're all well above 200. So the counties are even worse than the states in terms of severity. And there's not anything really obvious when you look at this to indicate that they're getting better. There certainly are some heading downward, but it's not one of these things where all the worst ones are getting better, which is a pattern we often see. All the worst ones are getting better. Not seeing that right here. So, which is interesting, because I think the counties have generally been looking better, but there's something maybe about the way the severities chart represents them that doesn't capture that. I'm going to go to the growth chart. The growth chart gives us more of a sense of whether things are getting better by county. Meh. Certainly in the long term, and maybe if we'd looked at it right here, which we did, on July 22nd, I would have said, hey, look how great the counties are looking. They used to be way up here, and now they've all headed down to here. Ignore the crazy ones. Since then, it's kind of, this rope has frayed a little bit, and there are some that are doing quite poorly. Still, 40% growth rate, and some that are doing well. It's a real mixed bag here, but I will tell you one bit of news that's pretty good, which is similar to the states. There are, in the top 20, there are 6 counties that are shrinking now, which you go back to here, and it was no one but Imperial, that crazy Imperial, who was ever below the 0 line. But now we've got Orange County shrinking sharply at 20% a week. Stanislaus was a weird one, but shrinking 20% a week. Los Angeles, shrinking 10% a week. That's really good news, because Los Angeles is the major contributor of cases. Riverside, also pretty important in the Los Angeles area, shrinking 20% a week. Sutter, shrinking, not a whole lot, but shrinking. So, and then the rest of these are kind of a mixed bag, but certainly it's good news at least that we have a number of counties that are now shrinking, as opposed to how the news has been for week after week coming up to this, where everyone was growing. There's a wild party happening here, with some of them getting suddenly worse and some of them better, and there's not a real obvious trend in this data. But certainly the one trend available is that the zero line cuts through the cluster. It doesn't go below it. So that's pretty good news for the counties. All right, I think I will stop there. It is a full hour. I tried to make these 45 minutes. Or I used to think they were going to be 30 minutes, but an hour is plenty. So I'm going to stop now. That is the news. So it's better. The news is better. Countries the worst ones tend to be shrinking. Kind of a mixed bag. Haven't gotten over it. The states are probably the best news right now, where there are just a lot of states that are heading downward in growth rate, and several that have crossed the zero line. And the counties are a little bit similar. The longer term trend seems to be downward, with a lot of them crossing the zero line, but then there's some concerning fraying on this rope, as some of these seem to be headed back upwards in the short term. So the county news is mixed, but better than it's been, and the state news is good. That's the news. I'm Greg Farrar. Thanks for watching.